Imagine waking up every day with a sense of peace, knowing that all of your needs are going to be met. No more sleepless nights worrying about your bills and your health or anything else in the future, or what your boss is demanding of you, or the next project, or, just how am I going to get from here to there? And none of those worries. You just get a nice night's rest. Wake up fresh every day, no worries. Sound impossible? Sounds impossible, doesn't it? I mean, that's not how people work. We have our worries or sleepless nights. And, man, sounds good. Sounds too good, right? Yet that's exactly what Jesus seems to have promised when he commanded that his followers seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness. Today we're going to explore how the seeking that Jesus advocated really can free us from the grip of worry about our lives. So let's begin by understanding what Jesus meant when he said, don't worry. The word Jesus used is based on an idea of something larger being broken down into its smaller parts. It seems like an odd word that gets translated worry, but that's what the base of that word means. When our attention is given to those smaller parts, anxieties well up from the uncertainty about whether there'll be enough of those small parts to make whatever that whole was, or if they would be the best part of things to make a better one. We don't want something less. We want, whenever the whole thing comes together, we want the right whole thing. As an example, let's say this larger thing that's getting broken down is something simple that we can all grasp. Sitting. Everything that you're doing right now, it comes easy to us. Some of the smaller aspects of sitting would be, will it support my weight? We usually don't worry about that when we come in and see something like this, right? Just get onto it. Is it stable? Is it going to hold me up? Is it going to be comfortable? But worry would well up whenever we question whether the materials that made up would be comfortable for us to sit in. Would they be able a long time? Would they be clean? Would they be healthy? And so we start to worry. I mean, is it going to be the right height for my legs? I'm a tall guy. I got to have some leg room here. Or I'm short and I don't want my feet dangling on there. I don't want a seat like that. Or if the material is going to be sturdy, I mean, it's going to last more than one day. Do I got to get another one? Am I going to have support for my arms? I want support for my arms if I'm going to sit. I want it to be ergonomic. I want it to promote good posture. I want it to reduce strain on my body. I mean, all of those worries start welling up when we're thinking about the small parts of this important thing of sitting. And those worries don't even consider, does it look nice? Does it match to the decor? Is it popular? What everybody else is going to be doing? I mean, literally speaking, our need could be met if we just went out and found an old tree and cut off a part of the trunk and just tilted it up, right? Like you do at a campfire. I mean, that'd meet your need to sit. But most of you would not be satisfied. I mean, it might be okay for the moment, for the day. But what about tomorrow? I don't want my needs met this way the rest of my life. The big idea that Jesus was addressing in this command that we're looking at today was to seek what we're seeking for. The big idea is life. He wants us to have this big idea about life, and we break it life down into smaller parts, and those smaller parts are the things that make us worry. You probably didn't know, but back in Jesus' day, they had several words that we now translate into English as life. You're familiar with some of them. They use the word bios, which they use to speak about physical life. We still use it today when talking about biology, the study of life. They also talked about psyche, which the Jewish people used to speak about the breath of life that God gave into a biological body to animate it. It's sometimes translated into English as soul. And we still use it today when talking about psychology, the study of psyche. But they viewed it back then as being much more than a person's ability to think and to process and to come up with answers. And they thought of it as more long before the French philosopher René Descartes would declare, I think, therefore I am. He was trying to define life. But even that great philosopher's definition falls short of what life is really all about. They also spoke of helikia, which was a word they used to talk about the numbers of the days that a person had to live. From their birth to their present, and they would use this word whenever they were talking about how many days you might have left until you might die. They also talked about zoe, which was the word they usually used to refer to a person's existence. We still use that word today too as zoology, the study of zoe, but we think of it as the study of living things not human, the study of animals. For Jewish people, their zoe word was sort of a catch-all word that encompassed every aspect of a person's life on earth and what they would also experience after death. That's why whenever it gets translated eternal life, this word zoe shows up most of the time. However, these terms and their meanings got mixed up whenever they were talking about life. They'd be using one word, but they'd be using it to talk about a different aspect when they could have used a different word, which leads to a lot of confusion whenever you're trying to figure out what they were saying back then. Even in the passage we have here, whenever Jesus said life, what was he really meaning there? Sometimes in the scriptures, psyche was sometimes used to describe the things that make up zoe, and sometimes psyche was used to talk about the things that are helikia, and sometimes zoe was used to talk about the soul instead of psyche. And so you kind of go like, okay, I've got the right word here. I know the new definitions you're supposed to be using, but it doesn't seem like you're using it that way. So what are you talking about here, Jesus? It's not just a matter of determining which word Jesus used, but how was he using it? What was he trying to communicate to those that he was speaking to so that we too can hear from him? We find in this portion of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount that he was challenging those who were gathered listening to him to really consider what they really believed about life. What makes up my life? The Greeks thought that life, psyche, was really about surviving and going from surviving to thriving. But they deferred that process in terms of our bios. So the smaller things that they got worried about were drink and food and clothing. Life was about acquiring and securing and storing and selling and developing and using and enjoying and controlling all of these things. Even their civilization was developed on this focus, trying to make other people do things for them in that regard, and also protecting themselves from invaders who might want to take it away from them. But really, when you boil it back down for them, life was defined about biological needs. How are we going to eat? How are we going to drink? Do we have nothing? Jesus compared them to birds who had the same drive to survive, but who didn't worry about the details as people do. Jesus implied that they lived this worry-free life. I don't know if you've ever said, hey, I want to live the life of a bird. I don't know about you. When I was growing up, I was taught that, be a bird brain. They don't have enough to think through things, so, don't follow their example. But Jesus is saying maybe we should. They acquire what they need each day. They consume what they need each day. And they don't worry about it because God has provided what they can acquire and eat each day. And they're in a situation where they can do that for the most part. He also pointed out, being Jesus, that if God provided for birds in this way so that they didn't have to worry about things, then he would also provide for us in the same way, because he cares even more for us. We will still have to acquire and consume. Those are our needs. But I'll be honest, most people today are not content to forage for their basic needs on a daily basis. Life's a lot more complex, isn't it? We're more civilized. Even so, Jesus used this comparison to teach them that they should trust God to keep his promise to provide, which he does, and that they should attend to their side of things, getting enough that they need and not in opulence so that someone else doesn't have. To emphasize that God was in control of every aspect of their life, even in his provision of what they could get and acquire for their basic needs, Jesus said, how can being obsessed over how your biological needs are going to be met, how can that ever add 1 hour to your hill of keep? And yes, he used that word. How can it add to the days and the years of your life? Jesus was trying to get them to understand that the life he was talking about was a whole lot more than your biological needs. Jesus also taught them that the life that he was talking about was more than satisfying your vanity needs. Most of us don't like to admit that we have those. He did this when he reminded them how the lilies of the field were clothed with a beauty that even Solomon couldn't attain. There's a part of me that has to laugh a little bit about this. We tend to want other people to dress nice and have other people notice, but you can't say anything, right? Because if you notice someone and they're like, oh, hey, you look nice today, you don't want to give them the wrong message. You don't want to feel, so we're stuck. Most people back then, like today, were so blessed that they were well past worrying about whether their clothing was going to protect them from the elements. They were on to more important concerns. What people were going to think of us from what we were wearing. I mean, because we try to project a certain image, right? We work hard at that. We want to look a certain way. We want to portray a certain thing. We want people to think of us a certain way. And a lot of that is based on how we dress ourselves, whether we are willing to acknowledge that or not. We make an impression. And we want to make a certain kind of impression. While they probably didn't want to dress like King Herod and his robes and such, they were still concerned about making the right impression for the people around them. They wanted to fit in, or the likes. Just like they didn't want to be like King Herod, I would also say they also didn't want to dress like John the Baptist. You know, the guy out there in the woods in the camel skin and stuff. You know, he was the weird guy. They wanted to sort of dress for success in their own way. And sometimes we do that by doing the opposite, right? Well, everybody's going to do this, I'm going to do that, and see if they accept me or not. Kind of a test. But we're still after that acceptance. It means that their hope for the impression that they were making was to be accepted or approved or maybe in some measure even adored. It takes time and it takes money and it takes effort to achieve those ends. But receiving these things from people is still not what the life that Jesus was talking about was all about. That's why Jesus reminded his listeners that the Gentiles, that is those people who don't know God as their Heavenly Father, sought to find fulfillment in their life chasing after those kinds of things, prioritizing those kinds of things, being worried about those kinds of things. They had no idea that God could provide what they were seeking, which is sort of why they weren't seeking him. And it's also why we find in this passage Jesus asking this basic question, hey, you guys who say that you're wanting to follow God, why are you following the example of the Gentiles? They're going in the wrong direction. Now, they would never have admitted that they were following those loathsome Gentiles' example, just as most of us would never admit that we're following the example of the world. I mean, we're Christians, we're following God, we're seeking his ways, we're not living like them. However, Jesus wasn't being fooled. He was watching the way they were living. He's going like, yeah, well, you sure look like it. Sure look like you're following them, even though you say you're not. You wouldn't have all the same worries if you weren't acting like them. That's when Jesus let them in on a secret. If God is the one who created life, He's the one who has sustained life, He's the one who is the provider of all we need in our life, He's even the one who determines what's going to happen after this life and to the afterlife, then maybe we should think about seeking what He wants and what He reveals. But maybe even first and foremost, we should look for His kingdom, His dominion, His rule over us, and seek for His righteousness, what He says is right and wrong, and what's going to be best for us. Jesus promised that those who did would have all of their life needs met. Now, He didn't use any of those words that I mentioned earlier for life when He said that. He said, all of these things will be added to you. But Jesus did tell them not to worry about tomorrow for the troubles it brings. He wanted them to stay focused on the moment of the day, on the life that they were living as it was happening. I think secular people today talk about it being mindful. He wanted them to be aware of what's going on around them and how they were responding to it. I don't know if you've realized this or not, but hunger happens in the today. I've never been hungry tomorrow. I've never been hungry yesterday. If I'm hungry, it's a today thing. That's when I'm hungry. And that's when my need for hunger needs to be met. It needs to be met today. Hunger happens in the day, and God's provision for it is in the day. That's what part of Jesus' prayer is, praying for daily food. I'm hungry today, I need to be met today. If your need is met in the day, then perhaps the extra that you have will be used to someone who hasn't had that need met yet. I know that this oversimplifies the problem of hunger, especially when we start considering the wider ramifications and all the people and the circumstances and the reasons there's hunger in the world. But when we seek God's kingdom, it nudges us in this simplicity of direction. When we seek what God is saying is the right way to meet our own needs and the needs of others, it moves us toward this simplicity that says, what can I do for them today? They're hungry today. How can I help them today? Instead of worrying about how everyone is hungry, maybe we need to draw in our focus a little bit and say, how do I take care of those who are most immediate to me? Maybe a part of my family or the social circles I work in. Maybe the people I bump into. I tell you, in Los Alamos, it's kind of hard. We move in circles, we don't bump into many hungry people. But there's a lot of opportunities near us and communities not far from us where we could find some opportunities to share with those who are hungry today. And if that kind of thing were to happen, man, a lot of the worries that weigh us down would get their proper focus. I mean, you've really been out about a lot of stuff, and you go see someone who's really dealing with basic needs. It helps you put things in perspective. It doesn't mean that's not something that you need to address, but it just puts it in the right way. I shouldn't really be stressed out over these things when I really am so blessed. We still have to do our part, but we have to start trusting God to do His part and His provision and His care. Even the jobs that we have and all of the stuff that we earn from it are not our own doing. It's a result of God's work in our lives. And He's not doing it just so that we can have more and more. Also, in this thing that Jesus was teaching about this sort of daily living, He wasn't banishing calendars or to-do lists or vision casting. He was advocating that we trust God for today and tomorrow and for all of life to come. Lydia, a woman who's spoken of, a businesswoman, is a powerful example of someone whose life was transformed by her seeking God. She was a businesswoman from Thyatira who sold purple cloth. She sold it in a city where people were looking for that extra special looking purple view and had the money to spend on it. They weren't people worried about their first world problems. She was also someone who was seeking God and trying to listen to Him, which means she wasn't Jewish, and so she was meeting with some other women from her own household, her own business probably, and bringing her own concerns, because she probably had a lot of worries in her own life. And she was down praying, trying to get some help from God. It's then that Paul and his companions show up. They preach the gospel to her. She believes, and she and her household are baptized. We like that part of the story, and sometimes we stop there. But she responds. She hears about Paul and his mission and these guys that he's traveling with. They've been in town for a little bit, but she senses a need in them, and she says, hey, you guys don't have a base of operation. Why don't you come to my house? You can be at my house. I'll take care of you. In that in-the-moment experience of that morning, Lydia, who had no idea she was going to have house guests, had no idea that she was going to encounter the grace of God, is transformed, and she becomes the home base for the gospel outreach in early Philippi. Lydia's transformation illustrates how seeking God's kingdom brings the unexpected into our lives and brings changes that really are for the better for us and others. Zacchaeus is another powerful example of someone whose life gets dramatically changed when he seeks God. We know his story. He is the bad tax collector who rips people off. And I'm sure he had a lot of worries, like being found out, getting caught for being a thief. But he wanted something better. He hears about Jesus, intrigued about Jesus. He's seeking Jesus. And everybody else is already out there. He climbs a tree. He looks down, and Jesus stops, notices him, and says, hey, I'm coming to your house. The unexpected happens. Transformation takes place that he did not schedule. It wasn't on his planning. He wasn't thinking about it happening. But it is a day thing, an in-the-moment thing that takes place. Seeking God's kingdom and his righteousness is not about making a commitment to read the Bible from cover to cover. It's not about, I'm going to spend more time in prayer. It's not about, I'm going to start showing up at church every time the doors are open. Now, all of those have good aspects. We advocate those things. But seeking God's kingdom is about making those changes in your life that make a difference for you and others. It's about living a different way than the world around you. Kingdom living. Zacchaeus knew he couldn't keep living the old way. He needed some kingdom living. And so he declares this. Look, Lord, look at me. Here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, which is a mission, I will pay back 4 times the amount. I am going to make practical changes in my life. I need to change. It demonstrates that repentance and that commitment and that understanding that God's way really is right. Seeking his kingdom, Zacchaeus moves from a life of greed and dishonesty to one of generosity and integrity. Seeking God's kingdom brings generosity into our life. You may recall how John the Baptist preached before Jesus did, calling people to repent of their sins, being pretty bold in doing so, baptizing those who would. But afterwards, they would ask questions like, well, how do we live now? Oh, we know how we used to live, but what's kingdom living like? And to tax collectors like Zacchaeus, he said, don't collect any more taxes than you're required to. That means start living with integrity and honesty at work. To the soldiers, don't extort money and don't accuse people falsely. Be content with your pay. Fairness, justice, contentment. A new kingdom virtue. John said, anyone who has 2 shirts should share with them one who has none, and anyone who has food should do the same. Back to what we were talking about that Jesus was preaching about, generosity and compassion. Practical changes take place in our lives when we're following Jesus. So if you don't want practical changes to start taking place in your life, then just content yourself with showing up and singing some songs. Content yourself with reading some Bible. Be happy, come to the Super Bowl party and rub shoulders with people. But I want to warn you, if you start seeking his kingdom and his righteousness, your life is going to change. You are going to change in these very practical kinds of ways. So let me tell you a modern story of someone whose life was transformed when she began seeking God's kingdom. Her name is Sarah Sand. She was raised in a Christian family. She drifted from her faith during her university years because she was taught that it's just a bunch of baloney. She believed it. Happens to a lot of people who grew up in church and go off to university. May have happened to you. She was not prepared for the numerous challenges to her faith, the pressures to do and live and experience things differently. She saw everyone else doing it, no thunderbolts from heaven. They seemed to be really enjoying themselves, and she wanted to enjoy herself. She was convinced that she had been deceived about the true meaning of life by some very well-meaning people, her parents. She, from everyone else's perspective, woke up. And she started living like all of her new friends, seeking what they were seeking in the same ways they were seeking it. And it brought into her life some momentary pleasure, but it also brought into her life the same worries that they were struggling with, the same stresses that they had no answers for. She started seeking peace in her life like everyone else was doing, and she was seeking it in the same way. She was not going to ever seek from what she had in her growing up, because obviously that wasn't right. Elsewhere. Where was she going to find peace? Yoga, relaxation techniques, meditation, healthy life choices, new diets. She adopted a more holistic worldview that made no judgments on anyone. She could just find peace if she just didn't judge anyone. But she kept being judged by those same people who didn't judge anyone. She became pretty defensive toward anyone who looked at her life and said, hey, we're kind of concerned about what's going on. It's a lot easier to defend your newfound faith than it is to live by it, she found out. She talked peace, she did what everybody else was doing, but she found herself growing increasingly self-focused, we might say self-centered. She became very angry at anyone who didn't agree with her, and she couldn't help herself. It led to a crisis in her marriage because there were times that she and her spouse didn't see eye to eye. Happens. But their solutions didn't happen. The crisis became so severe that it made her long for the simplicity of her childhood. Man, if I could just go back. But just have no worries like I did then. Her great conclusion was that the only real difference between her current miserable life and the one she lived back then was that she had a relationship with God, and she began to seek that. She tried to put it off for a while, but it kept nagging at her. Her marriage kept getting worse. She couldn't talk to anyone about it because she didn't want to admit that all these things that everybody was doing was failing her. She felt alone. She felt helpless. She needed a miracle, and she didn't believe in miracles anymore, but she wanted to. Her realization led her to seek again and rediscover that childhood faith. She just prayed what she knew to pray, Lord, I need help. And things started changing. She made practical changes, tangible changes. She started to treat herself differently. She started to treat some people around her differently. It happened in little things, She stopped along the road and there was someone standing there and she just handed some money to the guy in the corner. It wasn't a big deal, but it was something she could do. It led her in little steps toward finding the God who changes lives and who makes a difference when people begin to love like He loves. Eventually, it had an impact on her marriage, and it began to change as well. Her return to Christianity so profoundly impacted her life and her family's life over the years that she wanted to help others experience that same sort of change, and so she became a Christian counselor. She was already a counselor. She just integrated her faith with her profession because she wanted to help guide people into a better way of living. I'll just tell you, you don't have to become a professional counselor to do that. Life that Jesus was talking about only has two smaller parts that you need to worry about. Is God ruling over you? And do you trust Him to do it? The other little part is, do you accept His understanding of right and wrong? And are you willing to lean toward what is right and avoid those things that are wrong? When you do, your life is going to change. And you're going to get real practical about it. And if you don't get practical about it, you're going to get dissatisfied about it. This doesn't mean that we won't face troubles or tragedies, but we can count on God to lead us through them when we seek His kingdom and His righteousness. And we can trust that our God-given needs and those needs that we have are from Him. And that they'll be met in His way and in His time. And we can rejoice in the blessings that we do have. And we can become generous, loving, gracious people as He intends. We ask the worship team to go ahead and make their way up again. And as they do, I want to invite you to join that growing number of people who are seeking the Lord. There are many ways for us to do that. To stop playing games, even stop playing church, and start following the God that we serve.